Welcome everybody. I know we have a couple of hundred people registered for this session, and more people will be coming in as the session keeps going. My name is Stephen Kinsella from the University of Limerick, and I'm the hub leader for the Globalization Hub here in Rebuilding Macro. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. This is obviously a very, very important topic, where globalization goes after the virus and how it is impacted by the virus is a matter for serious interdisciplinary thought. And we have some really excellent speakers to address this today. So we have Isabella Weber from the UMass Amherst, who's also a grantee of the Rebuilding Macro Globalization Hub. We have Kevin O'Rourke, Professor of Economics at NYU Abu Dhabi, and one of my former professors, actually, back in the day. Meredith Crowley from the University of Cambridge. Chad Bown, who's from the Peterson Institute, but also co-hosts the wonderful Trade Talks podcast. And we have these are genuine stars of the profession, and I'm very excited and thankful that they've taken the time to come and speak to us all. So the order will be Isabella, Meredith, Chad, and then Kevin. Each speaker has about 15 minutes. If you want to ask them questions, simply type your message into the chat window and it'll appear for me, and I'll ask each question or each commenter a question at the end. We have ample time for questions towards the end. So Isabella, are you ready to talk?
Wonderful. Let me start by thanking Stephen, Angus, and Richard for setting this up today. I think this is really, really an extremely important topic, and also for funding our research. So all that I'm presenting today is basically results fresh out of the oven of our Rebuilding Macroeconomics grant. So this is joint work with Tom Westland at the University of Cambridge and Gregor Semeniuk here at UMass Amherst. So as we all know, the shutdown in response to the ongoing pandemic has pretty much caused global production in whole sectors to grind to a halt, which has raised the basic question of how the global division of labor should look like moving forward. So this presentation takes a long-term view on that question of the global division of labor, and thereby takes a long-term view on the COVID-19 crisis. My project here is to engage a comparison between the last era of globalization, that is the era of globalization that peaked just before World War I, and the present era of globalization that it looks more and more like it might have peaked in 2008. Of course, we have Kevin O'Rourke in the room, who is probably the foremost historian of globalization. So it is a somewhat daring exercise to do this here, and I'm looking forward to Kevin's feedback on my presentation. So I'm addressing two basic questions. Sorry, I just need to get rid of the videos to be able to see my slides. Okay. Okay, so I'm addressing two research questions here. The first one is, to what extent are patterns in the global division of labor path dependent across those two peaks of globalization, that is the peak before World War I and the peak just before 2008. So in other words, I'm looking into long-term trajectories of path dependency and what I like to call path defiance in export patterns. Secondly, I will ask, what do these long-term patterns tell us about ways forward in the context of the COVID-19 crisis? The second question, by its nature, is of course relatively speculative. I'm addressing this question with a novel database that we have created as part of that grant work that we are doing as a result of this Rebuilding Macroeconomics project. And our database is, to the best of our knowledge, the first database approaching global coverage of export baskets on the commodity level for the peak of the last era of globalization, or more specifically the years 1896 to 1906. We have chosen that data range, that period due to data availability. So basically what we have created is a snapshot of the structure of exports of that last era of globalization. And we have compiled this database from colonial and country level statistics as well as international compilation. And we have recoded the data using standard international trade classifications, which basically means that we have recoded the data in ways that makes it compatible with the most standard databases for the ongoing period, and in particular the UN Comtrade database 1962 to 2018. Now, this might all sound very technical. The key is that we are able to connect the data points for this period 1896-1906 to the data points in the 1960s. And we have benchmarked our results against what we already know in terms of aggregate trade flows. So we can be fairly confident that our commodity level data is consistent with what we already know about aggregate trade flows. Here is just a chart of how we have done that, and I'm happy to comment on that if anyone is interested in the technicalities in the question and answer. Let me move straight to the database coverage. So this is a map. Everything that you see in yellow is the territories or countries that we are covering in our database. Now, I'm glad to say that yellow is clearly much more than what you see in blue, which is what we are not covering. But we do have pretty big gaps, mainly in Eurasia and Central Africa. So now you can see again the map with our database coverage, and you can see that everything that is yellow is the territories that we are and countries that we are covering. Everything that is blue is what we are not covering, and clearly we are covering many more geographic territories than we are not covering. And we are also covering around 90% of world trade at that time. So in other words, our database hopefully gives us a fairly good representation of a very large share of world trade on the commodity level for that last period of globalization. So in order to engage this comparison, I want to look at a couple of different measures, and I want to start by looking at export diversification. So by export diversification, I mean whether countries export many different commodities or only a few different commodities. That is to say, whether their export baskets are very diverse, contain many different things, or whether their export baskets are relatively specialized, which means that they contain only a few commodities. Now, export diversification tends to correlate with high levels of GDP. I'm saying tends to because there are important examples. And export diversification also indicates that a country has competitive, productive capacities in a wide range of sectors. So in other words, if the export basket of some country contains many different commodities, it indicates that this country is able to produce relatively competitively commodities in this wide range of industries. Now, what we have done is we have produced a ranking of diversification across those two eras of globalization and with some data points in the middle. Now, let me step back and explain what exactly this graph shows you. I hope you find it beautiful, but I know that it's a bit messy. So basically, we have ranked countries on the left-hand side for the period 1902 to 1905, averaging out over those years, according to how diversified they are. So we see here that in the period 1902 to 1905, the United Kingdom was the most diversified exporter, which means it had a comparative advantage in the largest numbers of commodities, or in other words, it was exporting competitively a wide range of different commodities. In contrast, you see at the very bottom of that list, Uganda, which was the least diversified country, which means that it was only exporting very few commodities. And then everything in between is basically ranked according to their diversification in relative terms, relative to all these other countries. Now we have chosen here the period 1902 to 1905 to represent the last peak of globalization. Would have been ideal if we had 1909 to 1913, but data is better for that moment. And then we have here 1962 to 1971, which is basically the period of decolonization and one of the most vibrant periods of import substitution and infant industry protection policies in the global south. Then we have the 1980s, which we can consider the beginning of the era of trade liberalization. And finally, 1998 to 2007, which we may want to consider as the peak of the ongoing era of globalization. Now, what we can see here is that basically on the top, you have this big red layer, which I like to call the cream layer of countries, which is basically the countries that are very diversified in the last era of globalization. And across these different policy regimes in global trade in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, basically stay on top of the diversification hierarchy. Okay, those countries are predominantly the usual suspects: France, Germany, United States, Italy, United Kingdom, Belgium, Netherlands, and so on. Interestingly, for example, China is also already relatively high up in diversification in 1902 to 1905. And then basically also, despite all the different growth regimes that China is going through, stays pretty much in the upper part of the diversification hierarchy. If we zoom in a little bit and we look at the country level trajectories, we see that the group of the second most diversified countries basically stays on top, except for some countries such as Algeria and Iraq that strikingly they're very diversified in the last era of globalization, but then predominantly because of raw material findings, and for Iraq, of course, oil, they specialize very dominantly in some specific commodities. If, on the contrary, we look at the least diversified countries, so those countries that were basically specializing in raw material exports in the last era of globalization, and we're on the very bottom of the diversification hierarchy, then we see that they pretty much stay in the bottom half of the diversification hierarchy across time, with a somewhat hump-shaped general trajectory, which shows us that basically in the 60s and 70s, and to some degree also still in the 1980s, those countries did move up or tended to move up in terms of diversification. So they improved their export diversification. They started to export more different stuff, but then basically, with some exception, moved more or less back down in the most recent period. Now, this is of course only a ranking, right? So this tells us only about the relative degrees of diversification. That is to say, if we look at some specific period, who was more or less diversified, it doesn't tell us anything about how diversified trade was in general, what countries were exporting, what the structures of industries were, and so on. So I want to quickly take a closer look at that. So if we look at the composition of world trade in the last era of globalization, we basically find that around 60% is raw material exports, and only around 35% is exports in manufactured materials and machinery, which is here indicated in blue. So those results are also based on our database. If we compare this to the most recent period, you see that the picture changes into being much more blue and purple, which means that in this present era of globalization, manufacturing and machinery exports have become drastically more important. And of course, we have seen the outsourcing of production and the globalization of value chains, which basically means that production has become much more fragmented geographically across the globe compared to this earlier period of globalization. But despite these underlying structural changes in the composition of trade, this diversification hierarchy seems to be fairly stable, as I've just shown you. Now, if we ask ourselves, what is it that those countries that are not as diversified are exporting? Or in other words, if you're not that diversified, it means that you are specializing in your exports. So what is it that those countries that are specializing in their exports, what is it that they are exporting? And we have here a scatter plot of diversification and the share of raw material exports. And we can see that basically there's a very strong correlation in 1902 to 1906 between how diversified your exports are and how big the share of raw material exports is. So in other words, if you're not very diversified, chances are you will be exporting a very large share in raw materials. This correlation still holds for the most recent period, that is 1902 to 1906, but we can also see that all those dots have moved to the left, which means that in general, raw material exports have become less important compared to the last era of globalization. Okay, so let me then have us look at one more measure comparing those two eras of globalization. And that is, if it is the case that those cream layer countries are exporting many different things, whereas those countries on the bottom of the diversification hierarchy are exporting competitively only a few things, then it might be the case that most of the things that the specialized countries are exporting are also being exported by the diversified countries. So many of the things that specialized countries export are also exported by more diversified countries, is a basic hypothesis that I'm looking at here. So imagine the example of rice and tea. So for example, Burma and Japan are both exporting rice and tea, but Japan is also exporting so many other things. So if we want to plot this, we can say, and sorry, I've switched to Lao here, but the example should still hold. If a country is very diversified, it would be on a high position on the vertical axis, just as we had in the previous ranking. So for example, Japan is much more diversified than Laos. And then on the horizontal axis, we are ranking commodities by the number of countries that are exporting those commodities. So a commodity that would be very close to the origin, so would be basically here in this graph, would be exported by very many countries, whereas the further out you go, the less countries are exporting that commodity, okay? So for the example of Japan and Laos, we can see that, for example, gold is being exported by both Japan and Laos, but Japan is also exporting all these other things. Now, if this relationship holds in this diagram, we should see a shape that looks pretty much like this, okay? With basically a triangle on top, where most of the things that are being exported by countries on the bottom of the hierarchy are also being exported by countries on top of the hierarchy. Now let's take a quick look at how this looks empirically. And we see this is the data for 1896. And we see that it's pretty much such a triangular shape, which means that there is a strong tendency for countries that are diversified to also export things that are being exported by specialized countries. Now we know that most specialized countries are basically in this period, in this historic period, exporting raw materials. So this is to say that many countries on top of the diversification hierarchy are exporting both manufactured as well as raw materials, whereas those on the bottom of the hierarchy are basically only raw material exporters. Now, if we look at this same picture for 2007, first of all, we see that there are many, many more data points, which shows us that trade diversification has drastically increased in this present era of globalization. But we also see that this basic shape is still there. So in sum, we can say that if we want to compare the global division of labor across those two areas of globalization based on the measures that I've showed you, we can say that there's a relatively stable pattern of polarization between a diversified global north and a more specialized global south. That there's a global level of the global level of trade diversification has increased massively, and that manufacturing has globalized, which is to say that manufacturing industries have moved to the global south. And thirdly, that world trade is structured around the most diversified countries, with more specialized countries essentially supplying raw materials, and now in this present era of globalization, also increasingly manufacturing goods, feeding into the value chains set up by the global north. Okay, after this long introduction of this comparison of the last and present era of globalization, what does this tell us about ways forward in the COVID-19 crisis? And I'm basically looking here at two scenarios. The first scenario being a de-globalization scenario, which of course is widely discussed at the moment. And I'm looking at this from the perspective of three types of countries. So the first type of country is diversified rich countries. This is our cream layers, or the headquarters of the world. For those countries, I think, and of course this is speculative, bringing production home through tariffs or even expensing, as Cudler was suggesting, would be extremely costly due to the lack of infrastructure and workforce in those countries to perform many of the manufacturing tasks that have been outsourced. And in the context of what more and more looks like a very deep depression, I think that this would be economically very harmful. Now, while these diversified countries are more resilient because they can produce all these different things, they are more resilient towards shocks than more specialized countries. Nevertheless, bringing production home and concentrating production geographically, I think, would actually increase the vulnerability to pandemics and climate shocks, because those have local outbreaks and constitute local shocks. From the perspective of the medium diversified middle income countries, which are basically the workshops of the world, we could say that such a deglobalization could create some chances for import substitution policies, but the capacity problem to produce finished goods is very large. So on balance, I think that this would also be costly, and it would be costly to reverse export-oriented development strategies in the middle of what more and more looks like the deepest depression for a long time.
Isabella, maybe 2 more minutes?
Yes. So generally, more diversified economies are more resilient, but even for those economies, it would still, the argument that I just made still holds. Now, for the least diversified countries, deglobalization would basically be most harmful. So let me move to the second scenario. Please imagine a 2. Let me move straight to the second scenario, which I'm calling a scenario of global cooperation. And I know it's hard to imagine, but imagine a world in which the EU and the US had helped China to contain COVID-19 in Wuhan, and China, the EU, and the US would have collaborated from hour zero to basically prevent this pandemic from spreading across the globe. Of course, this might seem somewhat utopian, but I think in times of crisis as deep as the present one, we might want to think big, and we might want to think beyond the tendencies that we are observing. So such a global cooperation scenario would basically entail global cooperation to fight the pandemic and overcome bottlenecks that are reside of the structures of globalization that we have been looking at, that would involve globally coordinating rescue and stimulus packages, because if global production is globalized, then, and you want to have shovel-ready projects to invest in with big public fiscal stimulus packages, you want to think about the coordination across the globe. You would also want global cooperation to organize a transition from a just-in-time delivery type of globalization to a more resilient form of production chains, which could, for example, also involve something that Keynes suggested after the Second World War, that is international buffer stocks for critical inputs, medical supplies, and primary commodities for disaster relief. And finally, global cooperation could entail to implement health and environmental standards in production across the globe in order to prevent health hazards, tackle climate change, and improve living standards of those locked in at the bottom of the diversification hierarchy. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Isabella. It's brilliant to see the project evolving from its original project proposal to seeing the final output now. It's actually it's fantastic. So thank you for that. If we could move directly to Meredith now, and while she's unmuting, I'll remind everyone they can send questions in through the chat, and we're looking forward to the next 15 minutes with Meredith Crowley from Cambridge. So thank you very much, and take it away.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so what I want to do, following up on Isabella's work, which was showing us a little bit about cross-sector development of trade, and also really long-term perspective, I want to focus in a little bit more on post-1980. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about what we know about the Great Trade Collapse of 2008 and 2009, and what happened then, and what that can tell us maybe about what we're going to see with the COVID trade collapse. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about some recent research with co-authors at Cambridge looking at Chinese trade flows at a very micro level, and what that might tell us about how things will unwind as we start to get staggered releases from lockdown. So first, I'll talk about the Great Trade Collapse in 2008-2009. That was a bad one. This one seems almost certainly it will be worse. I'll tell a little bit about how Britain's experience with the trade collapse differed from some countries around it. Then I'll talk a little bit about what research showed were some of the key drivers behind the trade collapse, and I'll wrap up there by talking about global cooperation over import restrictions that actually worked out extremely well. So one of the good stories coming out of the Great Trade Collapse is that we actually did not see countries in the G20 putting import restrictions on. We saw far less in that sphere than we had seen in most of the previous recessions. And then finally, I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about what we know about global value chains, firm sourcing of intermediates around the world, and how exporters respond to bilateral exchange rate shocks, and what some of the elasticities we've learned from firm responses to exchange rate shocks can tell us about how adept firms are in adjusting their sales to different markets around the world, and what that might mean for the end of lockdown. So the Great Trade Collapse. So just to put the Great Trade Collapse in some context with some of the other large declines in global trade that we saw basically starting, this series starts in 1968. What I've got in this first figure is from a paper I wrote with Shi Lo at the Chicago Fed. And the left-hand panel shows declines in trade, where trade is exports plus imports of the country divided by 2, around various recession low points. And then in the right-hand panel, we have the same graph for the world. And essentially what we've done is we have taken a number of periods of trade collapse or trade decline at different recession periods marked in the US. At the bottom beneath the figures, you can see the nadirs of the various troughs. So 1975 Q2 for the first one, 2009 Q2 for the Great Trade Collapse. Now the Great Trade Collapse is the black line, and what you can see for the United States, it it surpassed all previous trade collapses since the late 60s in terms of its magnitude. And it was also, relative to some of the other bounce backs, it was a little bit slow. One thing that's notable is even when we get out 4 quarters after the nadir of the trade collapse, trade still hadn't recovered to its pre-collapse level. So the main point, the Great Trade Collapse of 2008 and 2009 was far larger than previous trade collapses. When you look at the decline in trade around the world, it was far more synchronized with the US than other previous trade collapses. But one of the nice things about the trade collapse, although it took a while to dig out, and even a year after the nadir, we still hadn't come back up to the pre-collapse volume. It was a little bit speedier, and some of this is being fed in by differences in aggregate demand growth around the world. Notably, China and India were still growing throughout the recession. Now, to hone in on where the UK was, in this graph we have a scatter plot where on the x-axis we have real GDP growth for a bunch of different countries, mostly high-income countries that have real seasonally adjusted GDP available. So this is looking at the decline in GDP growth between 2008 Q2 and 2009 Q2. And on the y-axis, we have the decline in real trade, where real trade is, again, exports of goods and services plus imports of goods and services. And so I've highlighted here the UK. Its real GDP crash was a little bit more severe than some of the other economies in Western Europe. Its decline in trade was on par with that in Germany and the US. So it's, did a little bit worse on GDP, not quite as damaged maybe as the US and Germany were. If we go to look at the bounce back in trade after the low point of the collapse, on this graph we have, again on the x-axis, the percentage change in real GDP growth. This is from 2009 Q2 to 2010 Q1 on the x-axis, and then we have the change in real trade on the y-axis. And so one of the things here we might be thinking about now for audiences in the UK is the UK's bounce back in terms of GDP was much more modest than for many other high-income developed countries in the Northern Hemisphere. And also its bounce back in terms of trade growth was pretty muted. So one of the factors here is that this is looking at trade of goods and services, and some services maybe didn't decline as much during the trade collapse as we would expect they're going to be declining right now with the COVID trade collapse. In terms of how do we understand the factors feeding into the Great Trade Collapse, a couple of things I'll throw out. If we go and we estimate long-term trade elasticities with respect to aggregate income growth for a bunch of different countries, and we try to use the actual sequence of income growth to predict how much trade would have collapsed during the downturn in trade, this sort of simple aggregate demand elasticities only can explain about 35 to 50% of the collapse in say, US trade. On the bounce back, it only explains even less, about 35 or 40% if we use a standard long run elasticity. So the question is, well, what's explaining, or what are the factors behind all of the additional fall in world trade? And so a number of papers have come forth to propose different factors. There's the problem of inventory decumulation. So countries that or firms that had run up big stocks of inventory were slow to get back into restocking their inventories. They started to come out of the recession, they just ran down their inventories. There were also issues associated with trade finance. Government stepped in and essentially helped to aid firms to keep global trade going. But quantitatively, neither of those was a huge problem. If we look at a paper by Eaton, Korten, Neiman, and Romalis that came out in the AR in 2016, they do a quantitative trade model and show that really the key factor behind why the Great Trade Collapse was so large was that it had to do with the decline in demand for durables. with decline in demand for durables, that essentially propagated through the whole trading system through global value chains. So if I demand fewer cars, I'm going to demand fewer car parts. And so this was really the key feature driving why the magnitude of the trade collapse was so big. One factor, and I'll just talk here a little bit about some of my work with Chad Bown. So one of the good things about the trade collapse, one of the things that wasn't a problem, was trade policy. So during the previous period, so before the Great Trade Collapse, Chad and I had done an analysis of how much high-income countries, how many import restrictions they placed on products as they were going into recessions. So here we have some estimates from a model for the US, the EU, Australia, Canada, and Korea, where we look at how much import protection at the product level these countries were imposing when they had either a real appreciation of the bilateral exchange rate relative to a partner, a negative shock to their own domestic economy, or a negative shock to the foreign trading partner against which they're going to impose import restrictions. And what we show here is before the Great Trade Collapse, a 1 standard deviation increase in domestic unemployment was associated with a 50% increase in the number of products that would be subject to new import restrictions. So that's the gray bar in the middle of the graph. Also, if your trading partner went into a period of weak economic growth, so if a foreign trading partner had a decline in their foreign GDP, the importing partner would increase the number of import restrictions by 60%. So quite substantial increases in response to macroeconomic shocks. What was different about the Great Trade Collapse is here we use the coefficients estimated from that model that I just showed you, and we use the actual sequence of GDP growth, real exchange rate movements, foreign GDP growth to predict how much import protection we should have seen during the Great Trade Collapse. And the left-hand panel is the prediction, the right-hand panel is what we actually saw in practice. And you can see at the peak here, our model based on what had happened in the previous 20 years showed we should have seen 647 products subject to import restrictions in the United States. So we were predicting based on the historical record that 15% of US non-oil imports would come under import restrictions. In practice, very few import restrictions were imposed, and they covered only 1% of US non-oil imports. And it wasn't just the US that was sort of well behaved. If we look at the European Union, the model doesn't quite get the timing for the EU right, but similarly, we were predicting using this macro model, 264 products being subject to new import restrictions at the peak. In total, we were expecting 14% of EU non-oil imports to come under import restrictions, and in practice, we only had 2%. So one good story coming out of the Great Trade Collapse is when countries do sit down and try to work on something cooperative, they are capable of doing it. We saw this work in practice. Now, it's also the case that we tend to see a lot of import restrictions when your own GDP growth is weak and your trading partners are also weak. Demand was just so weak during the trade collapse, there wasn't a whole lot of demand for protection, perhaps. And maybe that's the real story there. And so the last thing I want to talk about, this is a little bit disjointed, but thinking about what COVID is going to mean for trade in this next era, I want to take a step back a little bit and think through, the COVID shock is very different from all of these previous macro shocks we've seen. So we've got a supply shock, we've got demand shocks everywhere. Now, while everything going into the current trade collapse we're going through has been relatively synchronized, it seems likely that as we start to come out of lockdown, the relaxations on demand, well, there'll be relaxations on supply and demand, but it's likely that these will be staggered across countries. And there's also a possibility these are going to be intermittent. So we might see a relaxation of restrictions on production and consumption in one country, and then they could come back on again. And so what I've been thinking about is I have some recent research with Giancarlo Corsetti, Lu Han, and Washang Song, where we look at how do firms respond to global versus local shocks when they're making their export decisions. And so the key idea in this analysis is we use the universe of Chinese customs data over a 15-year period. And our first question is, well, just how do firms set their prices for sales in different countries? And so we might think that a firm chooses a price, it's a function of has some markup, has a marginal cost. And so it could be that the firm just essentially chooses one price for all different destinations. However, what we're interested in is the extent to which a firm is charging a destination-specific markup. So the firm's pricing rule might actually be it has some marginal cost of production, it charges some markup that's common across all of its foreign markets, and then it might look at the particular features of demand in a destination and charge a higher markup in certain markets where there's greater demand for its product, a lower markup in other markets that are more competitive in that particular product line. And so the question we have is, if you have a pricing rule like the second one, where actually the firm is taking a lot of response to local conditions in setting its prices, this raises the question, well, then what does this imply about how firms adjust their quantity that they sell in different markets when there are differential shocks? So the specific experiment we were looking at is we were saying, well, if China is selling something to both Brazil and to France, and there's a positive movement of the Brazilian real against the Chinese renminbi, there's an increased demand in Brazil relative to France. And how does that lead the firm to adjust its price? And how does it lead the firm to adjust the quantity it supplies to Brazil relative to France? And so
Meredith, maybe 2 more minutes?
Yep, okay, so in this paper, we developed some new estimators. One is to estimate the markup elasticity to exchange rate shocks. That's in this table presented in columns 2 and 5. And then we also look at the quantity response to exchange rate induced movements in the markup. And the key thing is when we break up commodity space to look at goods that are highly differentiated versus less differentiated, this is a new classification we developed, as well as their end use, whether they're consumption goods, whether they're intermediate inputs in production. The key thing is, if you look at the blue highlighted squares, highly differentiated consumption goods have a very responsive markup, but firms have a very inelastic, what we call cross-market supply response. So if there's an appreciation of the Brazilian real, a Chinese firm making a highly differentiated consumption good is very unlikely to increase its sales to Brazil. However, if we look at low differentiated intermediates, we've got a supply response across markets that's much more elastic. So the key point here is firms that are selling these less differentiated intermediates can adjust their supply of sales across markets quite rapidly. We also, in this next table, we're doing the same thing, but here we're breaking out by different types of firms that exist in China. So foreign invested enterprises versus private versus state-owned, and whether the goods they're producing are very differentiated or whether they're essentially not very differentiated, so in commodity type parts. And so what you can see here is for private enterprises in China that are making very undifferentiated goods, when there's an exchange rate shock that increases demand in a particular market, they have a very aggressive and highly elastic supply response. And so one of the things here is we think about the end of COVID lockdowns and demand coming online from different countries in a staggered way. We're going to see different types of products and different types of firms coming out of products that can respond very quickly and agilely to these shifts in demand around the world, where for other firms, it's going to be much more difficult for them to create new supply lines and establish new customers in different markets. And so for this type of firm, it might actually be quite difficult if we have intermittent demand returning, demand collapsing, demand returning, as you know, depending on how the lockdown proceeds. So just to wrap it up, the COVID shock, it's big, it's bad. the impact on trade flow is likely to be very large, very protracted. There's some possibility of getting global trade cooperation to work. The problem now is that in terms of domestic political pressures for certain types of products, it's very different in terms of the appetite for cooperation. And just lastly, how the lockdown is lifted could matter a lot for how quickly different types of trade start to return and how quickly firms can try to get back to profitability as they find that markets are opening and closing. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Meredith. That was comprehensive, and it was just really interesting to see it all put together like that. Chad, are you ready to go? And while Chad unmutes himself, can I remind everybody we've got a fair few questions in, but you can send questions through, and there's been a couple of questions about the slides, whether they'll be made available, and these sessions are being recorded as well, so no worries about those. So Chad, if you're ready, 15 minutes are yours.
Thanks. So thanks for the invitation, and I'll start talking, and presumably you'll be able to hear me. Now, I'm going to largely build off of what Meredith presented. A lot of that is because I'm very much in line with her take on this. Obviously, a lot of it is joint work. You know, and I'm spending a lot of time, thinking about these issues. All right, I'm kidding. I wanted to add a little levity before I started because my presentation is going to be a complete downer, unfortunately. So the title of my talk, and let me try to share my screen with you, is how COVID-19 could bring down the trading system. Can you see my slides all right?
Yes, it's
Great.
fine.
All right. So this is not going to be an optimistic scenario, but I think we've got a lot of folks in the policy world out there who are very, very caught up in the drama of today, which is on, you know, obviously the health crisis, you know, and even where trade policy is coming in, things on, you know, personal protective equipment. But part of our job in the trading system is to think ahead and think about a lot of the issues that Meredith has raised. And so I kind of wanted to build from her talk and some of the analysis and try to walk through scenarios in which things could actually be much, much worse without too much suspension of disbelief. Okay, so again, just picking up from what Meredith said, you know, when we think back to the last time around when we had a major economic shock, a global synchronized recession, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, there's a lot that we could possibly learn from that as a starting point. So let's look. Now, the big lesson was massive protection did not emerge relative to what we might have thought, feared, predicted, and Meredith showed you a lot of that coming out of our models. And I think, you know, what she didn't get into in great detail, but, you know, when you look at the overall data on general tariffs, normal tariffs, MFN tariffs, those hardly moved at all. They certainly didn't move for rich industrialized countries. And the barriers that did move were things like these anti-dumping, safeguard, countervailing duties, trade remedies, trade defense instruments there in Europe. You know, those are the time-varying policies that countries actually use. And so we did see a tiny bit of an uptick there, but not nearly as much as we might have expected, given how bad the crisis was and lessons from earlier episodes, right? So dating to the 1930s, we have been very, very worried that periods of economic downturn, mass unemployment, can kind of stoke nativism, blame it on foreigners, and lead to protection. And so that was the fear. Now this is just a chart to basically, you know, to put, this is the U.S. Import coverage of trade remedies since 1995. So take anti-dumping, safeguards, countervailing duties. This is the share of imports, the share of U.S. imports, manufactured imports, merchandise imports, that are covered by those sorts of import restrictions on an annual basis. And what you see a tiny little uptick 2009, 2010, but hardly, you know, much at all. And in fact, you know, it kind of declines afterward. And, you know, at least in this chart, and this chart was not for this particular purpose, but, you know, there was just no evidence whatsoever that we saw a lot of this stuff kick in, which I think for a lot of us that study trade policy was quite surprising. So why was that? And as Meredith pointed out, there's a number of economic features I think that we were able to pin down in terms of our results. An important one was the flexibility of exchange rates, how quickly the dollar and the euro depreciated after a substantial spike really, really early on in the crisis. But then also what she indicated about cooperation, right? And so starting in November of 2008, you had the group of 20 got out ahead of this with these statements and really did much there. And I'm going to come back to this point because this is going to be an important counterpoint for the world in which we that we live in today. Other, I think, contributing explanations were global value chains. This wasn't part of our research, but you know, the argument was there's simply less demand for protection because firms didn't want it, because they had cross-border supply chains and they knew in and of themselves that they might be exposed to that. I'll come back to that as well. And then also, you know, obviously a big positive response in 2008, 2009 was, you know, reasonable domestic policy. And, you know, amongst ourselves, economists, we can quibble about whether there was enough, you know, stimulus, whether it be fiscal, monetary, the right forms, but it was largely proactive. And when you compare the world in which we lived through then to, say, the 1930s, it was very, very different, right? And people like Kevin Duggar will be able to point out those sharp differences. Okay, so why will things or could things be worse this time around? Meredith already, I think, pointed out some of these. The economic shocks will be likely to be much, much bigger. And so, you know, increases in unemployment, reductions in GDP. So that's going to be a big one. You know, if you were to just kind of throw today's shocks into our model, you might expect a lot more protection to arise. There's the big question, of course, is will policymakers get the first order domestic policies correct? And that's going to be really, really hard. And as Meredith indicated as well, there's also going to be this issue of the asynchronous opening up of the manufacturing sector in different countries at different times. And then maybe having to close things down again as the disease comes back. And this is just going to be very, very complicated for policymakers to get right, especially in light of domestic politics. On global value chains, well, so let me walk us through the argument there a little bit. And this kind of draws out some of the insights from some work I did with Emily Blanchard and Rob Johnson. And so basically the political economy argument of the role of value chains and protection is not complicated, right? When you start to think about firms, you know, as being importers and exporters, you know, these big global multinationals say, you can understand they less and less want import protection on their output, because doing so, getting that protection ultimately feeds back and hurts themselves in terms of their own exports of inputs, right? And so you think about the classic iPhone example to make this case, and I'm sure to this audience I don't need to explain that. And so the argument there is just kind of over time as supply chains develop, policymakers were becoming more and more responsive to domestic political economy demands that less protectionism was sought. So what's different today? Well, there's very much the sense that in some sense, at least, policymakers don't care anymore. And certainly we're seeing this in multiple respects in the United States. And the negotiations for the US, the renegotiations of the NAFTA agreement, you look at how the rules of origin for the automobile sector were completely orthogonal to what the industry actually wanted, and were written in a way to try to reshore some of that domestic production back from Canada and Mexico into the United States. So, you know, it's changing. Maybe it's changing political economy weights of something or other. Maybe it's labor or something like that. But there's definitely the sense that you know, policymakers are just less sensitive to the interests of sort of maintaining or expanding global value chains than historically. Obviously, in the UK, this is getting caught up in the Brexit negotiations. but we're seeing this as well in the trade war, the Trump-China trade war, and the question of decoupling and sort of reshoring, right? When you look at the tariffs that still remain, even after the phase 1 deal is now in effect, you know, over 80% of U.S. imports of intermediate inputs from China are still covered by the trade war tariffs, and most of them at 25%. And this is over $100 billion worth of imports. So, and it's not as if no one has told or made this case to the administration. It has been made to them time and time again. They don't care, right? At least a lot of today's current policymakers just are not swayed by this as being an important argument, or they just have different preferences. Okay, how about the question of cooperation? Well, you know, as I went back and looked into this, it was kind of amazing what we saw starting in November of 2008. And so again, you know, when trade was collapsing, the world really didn't quite know how bad things were going to get. In the United States, there was considerable leadership taken by an administration that really didn't have to do this. This was the tail end of the Bush administration after 8 years. It was deeply unpopular at home. It was deeply unpopular around the world. And it somehow managed to cobble together this new group of 20, right? So back then, the group of 20 didn't, in its current form, didn't really exist. It did exist at the finance minister level, but it didn't exist at the leader level. And so they managed to put this thing together and got global cooperation beginning in November of 2008. And starting with this, you know, this statement that we kind of have now taken for granted, with the exception of the last couple of years, that they're going to refrain from protectionism, right? This was carried on, you know, in April of 2009 in the London summit and kind of throughout. And so I think as Meredith indicated, there are lots of economic reasons to come out of our models why we might have expected to see a lot more protectionism emerge, not just out of the United States, but also out of Europe and in emerging markets. And it didn't happen, right? And so this, at least to my mind, speaks to part of the explanation there. Now, are we seeing that today? And I would argue that the answer is absolutely not. And so you had a trade ministers meeting on March 30th. There was no, obviously, statement coming out against protectionism in big forms. There was a little bit of language about, you know, worrying about supply chains for medical products. But even at that moment in time, the American representative, the Trump administration's U.S. trade representative, took the occasion to blame trade for some of the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, with this statement. Unfortunately, like others, we're learning in this crisis that overdependence on other countries as a source of cheap medical products and supplies has created a strategic vulnerability to our economy. Not that, thank you, China, for providing the world with lots of personal protective equipment that our doctors and nurses and hospitals need to be able to treat patients to fight this thing. Nope, it's an overdependence on trade and not an opportunity to make the world better. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to see cooperation. Also, obviously, we forget a little bit that this is still where we are. The United States and China, despite this phase 1 trade agreement, still have massive tariffs on one another. Tariffs were not reduced as part of this agreement. They're still right around 20%. US tariffs toward China before the trade war started were about 3%. So bilateral cooperation between those two is nowhere to be found. And so then you say, well, okay, it's not so leadership is not going to come out of the United States. How about elsewhere in the world? During the crisis, or during the Trump administration, I should say, the EU has taken tremendous leadership. Japan, Canada, a lot of these countries have done amazing things to try to keep the trading system going. But what do we see? Well, unfortunately, right, in early March, you've got the export restrictions on PPE breakout across Europe, where you've got France, Germany imposing export bans on masks, gloves, respirators, not to the world, to the rest of the EU, right? Unbelievable. And so the EU, the Commission has to step in the middle of March and say, okay, if you guys agree to trade with each other, we'll agree to impose export limits, export restrictions on this stuff toward the rest of the world. So hardly a good step, hardly a good sign for multilateralism in the trading system is this early European Commission action. And that obviously contributed to their lack of an aggressive contribution at the trade ministers meeting. Phil Hogan came out at that meeting and said he wanted a more ambitious statement. But when he surely had to spend his time at the meeting explaining why their export limits on PPE weren't as bad as everybody might have thought. And on this chart, what I do is to try to show just how exposed a lot of developing countries are to these things, right? You look at Eastern Europe, you look at North Africa, you look at Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a number of countries that are very heavily reliant on imports from the EU for their personal protective equipment that run the risk of getting cut off from all of these things. So hardly a good sign early on in the crisis about cooperation. And then obviously I can't go to give any presentation without checking Twitter before I get online. This is from late last night or early in the morning on European time. The president has just signed an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration into the United States. Right, so obviously we're not going to see any leadership coming out of the United States, coming out of Washington. We're in an election season between now and November. The president is going to be grappling for anything he can to be able to anybody to blame the current state of U.S. economic conditions on. And so whether it's immigrants today or very, very shortly, it's going to be, trade, especially if you start to see imports from other countries starting up their manufacturing sectors, reopening and starting to ship before the United States is able to do so. So I want you to I'm going to close on this. Imagine this kind of worst case scenario for protectionism. We get this sort of asynchronous opening of the manufacturing sector that Meredith described, maybe China, South Korea, lots of other countries open first. Well, toward China, the United States is already shut off, right? We've still got all those tariffs in place because of the trade war. We've got a president that's going to be looking to lash out anywhere he can against foreigners as he prepares for 2020. I think we can expect to see a lot more protection coming out of the United States. So being shut out of the United States, other country, I have China here, but it could be anybody, is going to try to start to ship to Europe, right? This is the kind of standard trade deflection argument that Meredith and I put forward a long time ago, that we see evidence of this kind of stuff. And so the big question is, will the G19, so basically everybody else aside from the United States, be able to cooperate and keep things open? At the moment, I'm not optimistic given where things have started with. But I think one thing that policymakers need to do is to recognize they're not going to be able to wait for Washington. They're going to need to go at it together without them. Now, we've seen some positive statements coming out of some of the smaller, more open economies, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, on supply chains, and some of the anti-protectionism stuff that we used to see coming out of the G20. Maybe it'll come out of there. But I think the argument is it needs to come soon, because if not, the domestic laws are set up in a way to accommodate lots and lots of protection. The countervailing duty law in particular, all the subsidies that have been granted out there, all the industries of the world are going to be able to show that they've been injured. And then you just have to make the case that, well, my competitor abroad got a subsidy. Doesn't matter if I got one too. You make the case that they got a subsidy and all of a sudden you can receive protection sort of automatically under the existing laws. In any case, for any policymakers that are on the call and paying attention to this, I think we need to look ahead and to be prepared for this kind of world that might soon be at our feet. And with that, I'll stop. And sorry for depressing everybody.
It's okay, Chad. I believe the collective noun for a whole bunch of economists on the internet is a depression. So that's grand. Not to worry at all. That's a very, very interesting talk. The idea of the automaticity of protection and it just breaking down is it's something we'll definitely come back to. There's been quite a few questions coming in. Again, if you have questions, just lash them into the chat and I'll put them to the speakers. So with that, our last speaker, Kevin O'Rourke, can you take it away, please?
I can, and I don't have any slides, so I'm not going to share my screen or anything. So
no worries.
You can, I guess, get rid of the share screen thing there. I don't know how to do that. So I want to start with a couple of obvious caveats. And the first obvious caveat is that, like everybody else, I'm still processing all of this, and nobody knows how long this current lockdown is going to last, how it's going to end, when it's going to end, what the world's going to look like when it ends, what we're going to feel like once it ends. I mean, I think we're all a bit traumatized as it is, even those of us who are lucky enough to live in rich countries, and even those of us who are lucky enough to be relatively well off were traumatized. So God knows what we'll be like by the time this is over. And so you don't want to rush to judgment about what the world's going to be like down the line. And the second obvious caveat is that, you know, and many people have made this point, but we all run the risk of concluding that COVID-19 proves that we were right all along. And I'm certainly not immune to that temptation. I guess that I've been brought on to talk about de-globalization and to talk about whether there are any historical analogies that can be helpful for us here. I'd like to begin maybe by just saying that, in my view, I mean, I use the word globalization all the time, but I'm not sure it's a terribly helpful phrase in some ways, because globalization is a very multidimensional process, and the different dimensions have got very different welfare effects. I mean, commodity trade is one thing, capital flows are another thing, migration flows are another thing, political globalization, multilateralism is another thing. The spread of disease, which has been part of globalization for millennia, is another thing. So I don't think we want to back ourselves into a corner where we are either pro or anti-globalization. I think that's much too crude a way to think about these things. And I think that's an even more important thing to say right now. I'm going to focus largely on trade, and I'm going to talk about multilateralism as well, because to me, the most important issue is keeping political multilateralism alive. More so than any particular business practices that we may have in the world today. When you talk about trade, what do you mean by de-globalization? I mean, to me, de-globalization is increase in the costs of doing business across borders. So it could be increased transport costs, or it could be tariffs, or it could be quotas, you know, and we've seen plenty of real de-globalization in the past. We saw tariffs going up to very high levels in the late 19th century. We saw tariffs and quotas in the interwar period and exchange controls. As both Meredith and Chad have said, we haven't seen that recently, except, I mean, in America, in the USA, which is the big and worrying counterpoint. The implication of that definition, my own self-definition of globalization, is that if a business decides that actually it was overextended in a manufacturing in, let's say, China, and that in retrospect it had put too many of its eggs in the one basket, and in retrospect it would be better to onshore, that would be a reshore, that would be a less risky thing to do. And if as a result we saw less trade, I mean, to me that wouldn't be deglobalization in any meaningful sense. You know, it's only deglobalization if the cost of doing trade have gone up, you know, and even if you chose to define it as a global deglobalization because it would involve less trade as a share of GDP, I don't think it's anything that anybody should be worried about. That's my own view. In terms of historical analogies, I mean, it's hard to find one. The late 19th century saw widespread deglobalization, which happened through a kind of classic channel. There was a big decline in transport costs. There was a surge of trade all around the world. This created winners and losers in Hexarolan fashion. Among the big losers were farmers and landowners and peasants in Western Europe, and where they were sufficiently powerful, there was a political backlash and there were tariffs imposed. So that's an example of deglobalization. And there is an analogy there with what's been happening, especially since China's entry into the WTO. And I'm convinced myself by people like Autor et al. I mean, it's a more complicated model than Hexarolan. There's regional stickiness in there, which isn't in the standard Hexarolan model. I'm convinced by Colantoni and Stanek talking about Europe and so on. So I think there is an element of trade-induced backlash that's going on. And, you know, these people in Warwick have sort of shown that, especially when you have austerity superimposed upon exposure to destructive import competition, that's really when you can get the political reactions going. That's part of the Brexit story, I think. So I'm convinced by that, but obviously COVID isn't that. You know, COVID's been superimposed on that, but it was there already. The 1930s are another possible analogy, but it doesn't work. I mean, there you had wholesale protection, basically because people were trying to boost demand. You know, they were trying to cut imports to boost demand in Keynesian fashion. And whether it worked or not is an open question. You know, one of Barry Eichengreen's earliest papers was one where he showed, made the point that, look, it could actually be individually rational for a country to do this. And Clemens and Williamson have evidence that tariff rates and growth rates were positively correlated during the Depression. Of course, collectively, it may have been disastrous. But we're not there yet. You know, there's maybe America, there's something going on there, although they're at full employment, or were before this COVID thing hit. But it's not a great analogy. As Chad mentioned, the key thing, I mean, if you're thinking about the 30s, is to get the domestic policy response right, and we did by and large do that. I think the big exception is the Eurozone after 2010. I think that had predictable political consequences around the periphery of the Eurozone. We're seeing those in Italy. We've been seeing them for a long time. But again, that's not COVID. But COVID has been superimposed upon that. A third analogy, if you want to be really pessimistic, is to talk about Germany and Japan as they rise to geopolitical prominence in the early 20th century. And that wasn't a very happy experience. And part of that had to do with their fears of being strategically dependent on other regions for vital raw materials, things like oil and rubber and so on. Raw materials that were particularly useful if, for example, you wanted to go to war. Now, obviously, we're going to be worrying about strategic dependence or independence going forward, but there's a difference between oil and rubber on the one hand and face masks on the other. The good news is you can actually produce face masks anywhere. You know, now some people may say that may be a very inefficient thing to do, but you can do it. It's much worse if you can only produce them in one location, because then what you have is a temptation to go out and grab them physically, which is what the Japanese did, and it's what the Germans did eventually. I mean, the Germans tried to produce oil and rubber, but it was ferociously expensive, and so to a certain extent you had countries going to war to get the raw materials that they would need if they went to war. So it was a particularly destructive type of circular reasoning that went on, and you know, Adam Tooze talks about this in his great book, and so on. So it sort of looks like an analogy, but it isn't really. I think if you're looking for an analogy, for me the most obvious one, I mean, is maybe post World War II, because post World War II, I mean, the world was traumatized. Certainly Europe was traumatized, completely traumatized. States had utterly failed them in their most basic functions, which is to provide people with security. You know, that is the state's basic function, to provide its citizens with security, and states had failed. And so there were consequences. And so what you have in the 40s and the 50s is an attempt to provide citizens with economic and political and military security. But at the same time, they also don't want to go back to the protectionism of the 1930s, because that wasn't great either. And so the question is, how can you balance, on the one hand, more protective states with, on the other hand, trade liberalization? You know, and actually the 50s and 60s we think of in retrospect as being a period of tremendous trade liberalization. You know, we don't think of it as being a protectionist period. It wasn't the developing world after they got rid of the colonialists. But in the OECD, it wasn't. It was a time of trade liberalization, but it went hand in hand with a protective state, but that involved a bunch of technical problems. How do you make sure that trade doesn't lead to a race to the bottom, or in other ways make it more difficult for you to give your citizens the security that they are demanding? So, for example, after World War II, there was a feeling everywhere in Europe that they needed food security. And so everywhere, including in Britain, you had national agricultural policies, okay? So if you're going to then move to a European free trade deal that involves agriculture, and that was the deal that was struck in the EEC, because with France and Italy involved, there was no plausible trade deal with Germany that was not going to involve agriculture. I mean, what's the solution? The solution is to take those national agricultural policies and replace them with a common agricultural policy. And similarly, there was a common fisheries policy and so on. So that was one approach. The other approach was to make sure that if you were trying to give workers social protection by, for example, limiting the working week, or having equal pay for men and women, or having, you know, decent pensions, or decent, you know, rights to vacations and this type of thing, well, you made sure that everybody faced the same constraints, you know. And so in the Treaty of Rome, there's a lot of social stuff that's built in, you know, right from the beginning. And this is largely because of French fears that the Germans would undercut them by giving their workers substandard entitlements to benefits of one sort or another. So there's sort of two approaches in Europe. There's common policies, and then there's sort of floors on regulations, so that there's a minimum level of regulation. And in some ways, I think that's maybe an analogy that's interesting in some ways, because we have an agenda going forward, right? And I mean, I can't predict what it's going to be, but one thing for sure, this isn't just an act of God, what's after happening to us. This is the biggest policy calamity in our lifetimes. It shouldn't have happened, right? The systems that were supposed to protect us from this failed. I don't think that we get anywhere unless we accept that, and I think that the big fear going forward is going to be not just that this recurs, but that the next virus will be worse. And so I think it's predictable that all of us for the next 20, 30 years, as long as the memory of this thing lasts, are going to be living in a world where citizens absolutely demand that states and the international system protect them from this kind of thing going forward. And so how do you do that in a way that allows states to fulfill their most basic functions, while at the same time preserving a kind of a multilateral space? And I guess it's going to be very technical, and it's going to be very detailed, and it's going to depend on the particular policy area that's involved. For example, I look at Europe right now, and you can see some of the logic of the single market, some of the logic of the Treaty of Rome in what's happened. So in the middle of March, various European countries put bans on non-residents coming back into their countries, and there was a bit of hand waving and, oh, this is a terrible thing and so on at the beginning, but finally the European Commission realized there was nothing that could be done about this. And I mean, it was a completely predictable, rational, natural response, because some countries had gotten lucky, other countries had gotten unlucky. Some countries were shutting down early, other countries were shutting down late. The ones who had gotten lucky, the ones who were shutting down early, weren't going to allow the other countries to impose negative externalities on them, and so they shut their borders. That's logical, and the result is that a country like Slovakia, with a population bigger than Ireland's, has less than 20 deaths. There's no point people saying, oh, this is terrible, and this will never work because microbes don't respect frontiers, all of these terrible cliches. Please God, it will continue to work for Slovakia. So what's the solution? You can see the EC is already inching its way towards what the obvious solution is, which is to try to replace these internal borders with a common external border. But of course, in order for that to work, you're going to have common policies. And that's a problem, because public health is not an EU level competence, it's a national level competence. So you can see what the agenda is there that they're going to push. And by the way, Stephen, this is going to be not good news for us in Ireland, because we're not part of the Schengen area. I suppose because of the Northern Irish border issue, how can we be? So we're going to be part of the UK germ pool. And so, so what's going to happen in Europe isn't necessarily going to be great for Ireland, but I think it's inevitable, and the question is, to what extent can that sort of effort be broadened, so that, quarantine-free travel can be extended to progressively broader areas over time, because I do think we are looking at quarantining for the foreseeable future unless we get a vaccine. I think they're going to be all sorts. I mean, I think people are going to look at public health, if I could say it's diplomatic, public health and food safety regulations in partner countries. If they're not up to snuff, there will be implications for the sorts of links that we have with them. That's just inevitable. It's just inevitable, and people should just accept that. And governments would be responsible if they didn't do that. So I think the key distinction that I'd like to make is a distinction between multilateralism on the one hand. It's crucial that we protect that, and on the other hand, business as usual. I think that we are going to see governments trying to make sure that they don't end up in a position where they're scrambling for PPE equipment because there's not enough of it in the world, and what do you do, and you're having emergency flights going out to China, and so they're not going to put themselves in that position anymore, right? But the question is, how can you manage that in as multilateral a stage as possible? I mean, if what we want is resilience, which means excess capacity, I guess the market on its own isn't going to provide us with excess capacity to produce stuff. So there's going to be a role for states there, but you can do that in a more or less multilateral manner. Similarly with quarantine, which is another obvious policy area. But I think that there are knock-on implications then as well, because I think one of the most interesting things that this crisis reveals is about human preferences. Because, I mean, the really striking thing is that, you know, these policies that are knocking multiple percentage points off of GDP in order to save lives, I mean, they turn out to be massively popular. And if anything, majorities of voters, at least in Europe, are saying, actually, we'd like them to be tighter, please, these restrictions. Now, we'll see how long this lasts. Maybe once paychecks are seriously hit and so on, people will revise their opinions. But for now, there's a clear majority in favor of what's going on. That's telling us that people are very risk averse. And it's telling us that people really care about human lives, you know, and they don't just care about their own life. They care about the lives of those that they're close to. They care about the lives of their neighbors, their friends, their colleagues, and even the lives of perfect strangers. And none of this really should have come to any surprise to anybody, but as we're economists, maybe it does come as a bit of a surprise. I think it maybe has implications for cost-benefit analysis down the line, but I think it is going to have implications for policy, you know, because it's telling us what people want, actually. It's telling us what people value. Macron, in his FT interview, if anybody saw that, used the word anthropological a few times. I think this is what he meant. I think he meant that this crisis is telling us something about preferences going forward. And so, for example, you know, there's a clean air agenda in cities. Surely in Europe, that's going to be stronger now. That's going to be very bad news for the German diesel industry, you know, but you know, maybe good for people's health. I think climate was, again, you know, COVID isn't climate, but COVID's been superimposed on climate. It was already going to be an agenda at the top of the agenda in Europe. It's going to be even more so now. And there clearly there's a role for multilateralism, you know. It may involve what some people might call de-globalization, you know, because a carbon tax is going to raise transport costs, right? So that's de-globalization in a sense. Welfare enhancing, on the other hand, because of the negative externalities involved, you know. And if you take the agenda seriously, it's certainly going to involve carbon taxes at borders. I mean, Europe's moving in that direction. I mean, it makes no sense to try to reduce carbon emissions otherwise. You can't let free riders impose negative externalities on everybody else. That shouldn't be a controversial matter. Obviously, you know, it would be better if that were done in as rule-based a manner as possible. Even better still if everybody agreed to come on board. But given that there are different policy preferences in different countries, that may not happen automatically. So I think that if we, I think what international liberals need to do is they need to avoid a few pitfalls. I think they need to avoid defending as a package deal all separate elements of globalization. I think this is a time for pragmatism above all else. And I think that the thing that we need most of all to retain as an international community is the rule of law, which is why what Chad called the C-19 is really important. We need to get we need to try to maintain, if not the WTO, some WTO type equivalent on life support until we get a better occupant in the White House, you know. But we need to promote multilateralism more generally, because we face many collective problems, and we're always better off solving them collectively. But that doesn't mean that states won't and shouldn't intervene to protect their citizens, because they are going to have to do that in the years ahead. And that's me.
That is fascinating, Kevin. The idea of you know, moving from a common agricultural policy, you know, from the 50s, 60s, and 70s to a common health policy, you know, and then kicking out, you know, certain countries because they don't have a serological passport or something like that. It's a very, very interesting.
I mean, these are not necessarily normative statements. These are positive statements.
No, I agree. I agree.
You could make them normative if you wanted to.
I agree.